Well, welcome aboard, folks. It's Dr. Charles Parker, and we're here. We really appreciate very much the opportunity to do this presentation with this Autism Recovery Summit. We feel very privileged, to tell you the truth, because we've been colleagues with Dr. Waller and his crew for a long period of time, and we do consider it a privilege. First of all, just let those of you who want to follow this recording by using a PDF. You can get the PDF by going to this corebrainjournal.com/ARS, Autism Recovery Summit, and it'll be real easy for you to follow there. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about ADHD, and we're going to talk about the fact that it is a biochemical therapy approach that we really need to change to for this Autism Recovery Summit. And we're using ADHD as a beginning place because, you know, the truth of the matter is ADHD is the most commonly, most pervasively misunderstood, and it occurs with individuals suffering with spectrum disorders. In fact, I've had so many people that have significant ADHD problems that are called autistic or Asperger's that when you fix the executive function, and it can be fixed, this just dematerializes, it's gone. So the issue is, let's make the diagnosis really clear and not diagnose human beings based on how they look, and get further down the road with a full understanding scientifically of what's going on. So my background is simple. I came here as a child and adult psychiatrist. I graduated in '74 from those adventures. I became a psychoanalyst in '78. Yes, I'm now a recovering psychoanalyst. And then I began being involved. I had a reformation about 22 years ago and realized that psychopharmacology was happening big time, and I got into it. I was really very involved with psychopharmacology for 22 years. Then I began to be more interested in evidence and was certified by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for SPECT brain imaging. Worked with the Amen Clinics, Dr. Daniel Amen in Newport Beach, California, for 4 years. It was a very interesting thing. We opened his first East Coast office before he had the one in New York and Georgia. And it was a very interesting adventure for both of us. And I consider it a privilege to have worked with Dr. Amen, in spite of the fact that the whole evolution of neuropsychiatry has changed so dramatically. I appreciate him being a person who was really interested in chasing down the evidence. And then I wrote a book in '92 called Deep Recovery. And then more recently, in 2012, I wrote New ADHD Medication Rules, Brain Science, and Common Sense. Folks, you know as well as I do that if there is no brain science, you can't use common sense based on appearances. Then I've been a medical director for 37 years in and outpatient. So transformation to the informed use of biomedical protocols is based on comprehensive thinking about the thinking process. It's amazing, if you think about it, that we're treating human beings globally without paying attention to about 50% of brain function. You know, we have a great deal of fascination regarding emotions, sad, mad, anger, rage, the whole thing. But thinking about thinking, that is not the standard of care. And to me, it's amazing. And people are being given medications without thinking about thinking. Tonight, folks, we're going to deal with the process of thinking in great detail, and I hope it's helpful for you. So why would we want to improve? Well, there are problems, and the problems, I'm going to outline them for you. Inadequate labels create lockdown, polarized, reptilian thinking. That may be only the first time I talk about it tonight because, you know, it's one of my favorite terms. Nowhere is reductionistic thinking more obvious in psychiatry than, quote unquote, ADHD. And I say quote unquote because we are moving way beyond that term. That's an appearance term, and executive function is a new way to think about human beings, whether they're children, spectrum, adults, it doesn't matter. We have to really think more functionally and brain functionally about human mental functioning. And yes, I said it, ADHD is the most frequently misdiagnosed label on the planet. And we're going to talk about that in great detail. ADHD clinical we're going to ask, what are functions? If we're talking about clinical and we want to get away from just appearances, what are functions? What are we actually paying attention to? Well, as you can guess, it's more complicated than you might think at the outset. Appearances, my friends, as you know very well, are not functions. And hyperactive, inattentive, and combined are archaic terms, my friends, and you all know that because they put people in boxes that really, in a sense, don't exist. You know, we're in, my friends, a Galileo mind moment. Right here, it reminds me about this. You know, and people were burned at the stake when Galileo said, there's a whole nother universe out there. The sun is not rotating around Rome the way they think it is. It's actually, we're rotating around the sun. And people were actually burned at the stake. Galileo got off, luckily, by being very careful and apologetic and so on. But the bottom line is that telescope, that tool, took him and all of us scientifically into a completely different universe. And my friends, in psychiatry regarding ADHD, we're not using the available tools to study the universe that's out there that we should be paying attention to. As the old New England farmer said to the city slicker, asking for directions, in fact, my friend, you just can't get there from here. He was asking for how to get to Millinocket, Maine. All right? And system markers do matter. And all the writings I have at Core Brain Journal and Core Psych for years have talked about markers. And, you know, it's funny. I'm an odd duck. Why would we be, who cares about markers? Well, you know, it's the future is based on markers because the science has evolved and we can actually use those markers effectively. And a lot of people on this program know this because many of you are very well trained more than a lot of the medical practitioners because you know what markers are, you know how they work, and we just love talking to mothers who have kids with spectrum because they're as informed as any of us and they have good information. I'm going to try to add to that information tonight. So what's the difference between traditional labels and functional insight? Well, time is the variable, and time creates change, and we're in the midst of this change. This is a Galileo mind moment. And you know, if you think about it, traditional is acute and reductionistic. All of medicine has been focused on how can we get this done like right now because this person's dying. That's the way it's been for millennia, folks. But now we have chronic systems, and it's no longer an emergency. With chronic, we have systems that are more deniable, more invisible. They provide discomfort, and they are complex. They're not simple. And it's, you know, the difference is pain is obvious, discomfort is not so obvious, and discomfort is more deniable, and it's invisible. So what we're in a state of nuance development. We're actually developing the process of being more insightful about the nuances of brain function. And one of my favorites here, Dr. Edward de Bono, who is a nominee for the Nobel Prize in Economics, still alive, a wonderful guy. He was a friend of mine. I worked with him for a while. Perceptions matter. Most of the mistakes in thinking, this is his quote, most of the mistakes in thinking are inadequacies of perception rather than mistakes of logic. Key point. And that link right there is a link to de Bono. And I'm just going to remind you one more time since we're early on in this presentation. You can go to that PDF that I was talking about, and I'll have it at the end of this presentation as well. And all these references are there, so you can really get, you know, bang for your buck with this situation and really know what's going on, because we are loaded with references through this slide set, and you can't copy them down while we're going fast like this. So what are the new targets? What are the markers? What are we looking at? ADHD markers include three main issues. Pharmacological markers, and I know a lot of you may not be interested in pharmacology, but if you know pharmacology, you're going to understand better the treatment options, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about clinical, and what clinical means for executive function and how that all plays out, pardon me. And then we're going to talk about the actual biomedical measures that will add to your armamentarium of diagnostic tools. And it's really quite interesting. So the pharmacology is the first problem that we really need to identify. What happens with treatment failure with stimulants? I mean, so many ASD children and adults out there have been treated with stimulants, and it's been a treatment failure. And why? Listen, I'm going to tell you, folks, it has nothing to do with ASD or any kind of developmental delays or any of that. This is the standard of care in the United States. Treatment failure is so completely common that nobody wants to see a psychiatrist for anything that has to do with ADHD or executive function. 90% of the people that come in my office say, can you treat me without medications? Because I have no faith in you as a psychiatrist. I have no faith in psychiatric medicine. Just give me a break. I don't really want to take medications. And you all know that. It's common parlance. So medication problems abound. I'm going to talk about solutions. Now, those of you who are kind of against medications, I'm not going to try to talk you into medications. I'm going to try to inform you so you know what to do if medication complexity comes on your table with a doctor, a person, with your medical team. You need to know about it. And this talk is going to tell you far more than most people know about medication problems. And you might as well know it because you're looking at problems with people you love and you want to get them straight. So this is what we're going to do. You know this already. This is totally basic for anybody that's working with spectrum disorders, but the rate of metabolism of medications and supplements matter. They matter. So if you don't know the rate of metabolism, then you're going to have unpredictable outcomes. It doesn't matter whether you're using any kind of supplement. It doesn't matter. The supplements are not going to work, nor are the medications going to work, because the metabolism is changing the entire spectrum of how that person is responding. So the most overlooked issue with meds is basic medical titration. This is like 100% of second opinions that I get. Not 99%, 100%, get this, folks, of people that I see come into my office for a second opinion. Now, we're just talking about medication alone. Again, I'm staying with medication so you get the big picture, and then we'll go down to the rest of it. Is they have no idea, my friends, about the duration of effectiveness of stimulant medications. Now, stimulant medications, remember this, don't work for 24 hours. Now, some people may say that Intuitive works 24 hours. It's not a stimulant, number one. And yes, it works longer than average, but the non-stimulants can work a little bit longer, yes. But the stimulant medications, the methylphenidate products and the amphetamine products, they don't work 24 hours. Why wouldn't everybody know what the duration of effectiveness is, predict that, and tell the patient, I'm telling you, this is a problem? And then we go into notes on medication treatment failure a little more explicitly. I'm going to tell you right now the three main big medical roadblocks that occur that keep the metabolism from working correctly and make the duration of effectiveness with medications unpredictable and make the outcomes of using the medication unpredictable. First of all, many of you here already know about immunoglobulin G, and I differentiate that from immunoglobulin E. I call it the ghost immunoglobulin because so many people don't know about it. It's amazing. And so many people, I mean, I've been called a quack in my town because I've talked about IgG, and I get a immunologist or a gastroenterologist, and they'll say, hey, the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, I do name drop on that one, friends, and I think I've got it later in the slide set. But I tell them, listen, all you have to do is go listen to Alessio Faisano at Harvard, who runs the celiac research team there, and he's talking about IgG very effectively. And I call it the ghost immunoglobulin because it's IgG for ghost. It's not, it's in this nuance thing that I was talking about just a moment ago. If you have a nuance problem, it's going to be less visible. And if we're really only dealing with acuity, we've got to deal with something that's obvious. It's got to be in our face. What you and I are dealing with, things that are not in your face, that are not obvious. And then 2D6 drug interactions. Many of you know about genetic polymorphisms because we have an educated group here. And I'm going to tell you about 2D6 as it relates to stimulant medications and to other medications as well, because it is a catastrophe out there, my friends. People write for PROZAC and PAXIL like it's no tomorrow, mainly PROZAC with children, and they have no idea about 2D6 interactions. And we're going to talk about that. Yes, I'm passionate about it. I've made the mistake myself. I discovered this based clinically because of problems that were going on with patients that I was working with in 1996. So I've been talking about this nationally for 20 years. I'm passionate about it, and everything I tell you here is replicable in the literature, and I'll give you the references and the whole thing later on. And the third thing that creates roadblocks, metabolic problems that appear to be unpredictable is serotonin, dopamine issues, and imbalances between serotonin and dopamine. The high percentage of individuals that have ADD have a serotonin emotional touchy problem associated with it. And I call it touchy because I don't like the word depression, because it just limits a person too much. They have to be crying in the wind to be called depressed. And there's so many people that have emotionally vulnerable serotonin issues that are fixable with a little bit of correctly managed serotonin. And if you don't do it, if you don't know it, then you mix it up and do a dopamine product and they don't work together. I'll tell you about that in just a moment. So I think of IgG immunity as the tip of Mount Everest. Now, that's obviously not the tip of Mount Everest, but it's the top of the mountain. And what happens, everything trickles down to the very bottom, to the swamp down at the base of the mountain where the neurotransmitters reside. So it starts up here because if that IgG is off, if that food sensitivity problem occurs, the entire system and the gut and that entire gut physiology is the main immune organ in the body. You all know that. And what happens if it's off? The entire system is compromised in counterproductive ways. So I start at the top of the mountain with IgG and we work back. And here are some things about IgG that are easily measurable. You don't have to spend all the money, although we think IgG testing is imperative. But a person could say, well, let me just see if there's a problem here. Well, I'm hearkening back to Dr. Burkitt, who discovered and really documented Burkitt's lymphoma with research back in Africa, when he understood that the Africans back there had a transit time, and that transit time left them healthier than the colleagues and friends and patients that he was treating back home. Now, I've got it's funny, but it works. A 69-cent way to measure transit time. You don't have to go off the deep end with this. And by the way, this isn't me speaking from Virginia Beach off the top of my head. This is a Mayo Clinic tool. And right there at that corepsych.com TTT transit time tool is a reference from the Mayo Clinic on multiple ways they test transit time. And what you do is really simple. How do you test transit time for 69 cents? It's really simple. You buy a can of corn, you put some salt and pepper on it, whatever, you warm it up or cold, whatever you want to do. Eat it by itself. Look at your watch and see how long it takes to hit the toilet. And I've had people, grown adult guys that tell me I'm anally fixated with this. And what happens is, because I ask them the number 2 question, my favorite question of anybody coming in the door, doesn't matter whether it's a child, with ASD issues or a grown adult, I'm going to, how many times a day do you go? Number 2. I'm not going to start with that. Of course, that would be ridiculous. But I am going to ask about it. Why am I going to ask about it? Because the meds are going to be unpredictable if I don't know what I'm doing, and I want to know what I'm doing. So what happens is the Mayo Clinic reference is there, and that's a PubMed reference. I've just got a short code so you can remember it, corepsych.com TTT. You go, download it, there it is. And this is the reference that I had from Dr. Fasano chairman of pediatric gastroenterology at Harvard. His book, Gluten Freedom, and that's a reference to that book at genius.us. Faisano is, you can pop right over to Amazon and see that. And yeah, that's a little reference. Why wouldn't you know about that? Some of you are new. If you're new, you want to know about that book. IgG issues, they directly compromise metabolic rates, both meds and supplements. I said it once, I'll say it again. Now, I jokingly used to call this the New Jersey trifecta. I'm joking. I went to school in Philadelphia, did all my graduate training in Philadelphia. So New Jersey had horse races. They didn't have them at the time in Pennsylvania. So the trifecta is win, place, and show. And I've done hundreds, my friends, of these tests. And number one is casein in my office. Eggs is number two. And gluten is a slow third. I mean, if you go down the Pacific Coast Highway in California, you know, it doesn't matter. From Malibu down to Laguna, they have, you know, gluten-free, 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 all the restaurants all the way down. They're not talking about casein-free, but in the testing I've done, casein is more frequent. And I'm going to make a quick cautionary note here. I'm not telling anybody here to do anything medically. I'm saying these are the findings that I've had that are worthy of investigation. So I'm not saying everybody with ASD needs to go on a casein, egg-free, gluten-free diet. I'm saying these are frequently presented and frequently missed. And if you don't know that, then you have a corruption of the gut that throws the metabolism off. And these problems create, for example, CANDIDA challenges, which you know a lot. Sidney Baker's been talking about it for years. There's nothing new on that. And malabsorption occurs with toxins. Toxins then add to the entire problem. So then we have this other problem, and this is 2D6, cytochrome P450, 2D6. Now, why do I have a picture of a culvert? What would that be about? Well, 2D6 is a pipeline, my friends. It is a major imperative pipeline that we all need to know about in the liver. It's one of several important pipelines that most of the psych meds travel up through. I mean, three big ones are 1A2, 2D6, and 3A4, but I'm not going to go into details on that. 2D6 is the big one for stimulant medications. And there's specific things that happen with stimulant medications and specific antidepressants if a person has a comorbid depression that will actually interfere with medications and supplements because they block 2D6. More in just a moment. 2D6 is the amphetamine substrate. That means amphetamines run up through the pipeline of 2D6, and methylphenidate blocks 2D6. Now, when I was doing more brain scans, before I got more into the biomedical side of it, I had two physicians bring their daughter over from Scotland, and we did brain scans on them in D.C. and came down in the office, and she was completely disturbed. She wasn't suffering from an Asperger developmental delay, but she was very untreatable, and they had her on Prozac. I think she was on 40 milligrams of Prozac and something like 54 milligrams of methylphenidate. And one of the reasons they wanted to spend the money on the brain scans and come over to the States is she tried to jump out of a car on what in California they call it a freeway. I forget the name of what they call it in Scotland, but the bottom line is she almost jumped out of the car with the drug interaction that occurred between the Prozac and the methylphenidate. In that case, the methylphenidate and the Prozac were blocking each other. The methylphenidate blocks Prozac, which passes up through 2D6 and blocks 2D6. You can get an idea why I'm not a proponent of Prozac for children or adults. So 2D6 inhibition, these are the drugs that are caused that significantly interfere. And you can say out there, well, I've been on Prozac and I don't have this problem. I'd like to get a magnifying glass out and talk to you because it's very likely that you do have a problem. Prozac and PAXIL both block 2D6 and 3A4. So amphetamine medications, supplements run up through those pathways, and hormones for you folks that are women out there that have problems with your period are on Prozac and PAXIL. Estrogen, progesterone run up through 3A4. Well, if you're on Prozac and PAXIL, You can have significant dysmenorrhea, menorrhagia, cramping, and heavy flow. And I've seen adolescent women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome who also are on PROZAC and PAXIL and have significant estrogen dominance based on that interaction right there. Then WELLBUTRIN and CYMBALTA are lesser problems that related to dose. The more you get, if you get into 300 milligrams of WELLBUTRIN or CYMBALTA and you're running 60 with a child or 90, you're much more likely to block that 2D6. Then, in addition to those medications, you have what everybody knows on this call, 2D6 genetic polymorphisms. They can completely change the size of that pipeline. That picture that we saw, that picture that we saw of the opening there of the pathway changes. It can be big or it can be small. 5 to 7% of Caucasian individuals have almost no 2D6 function. This is in the literature. Well, if a person has no 2D6 no 2D6, they're going to have a very significant problem with any kind of an amphetamine product because they can't take it. Why can't they take it? They don't have a 2D6 that's operational. So from psychosis to treatment failure, anger and disdain. I've had people, I had a consult with a person in Calgary, Canada, and he called me because I've got these videos on YouTube, and I'll tell you about them before we close. And he had like, honestly, I really think it was 3 or 4 hospitalizations for paranoid schizophrenia, and he was on a total big dose of Prozac and Adderall. I mean, big dose, like 60 milligrams of Prozac and 60, 80 milligrams of Adderall. And when we got him off of that combination, I didn't take care of him personally, but I certainly did recommend to his physician up in Canada, and he called to thank me. It was just, it worked. So then we have this problem with serotonin and dopamine. Now, this one is much less commonly recognized, but is, my friends, I'm telling you with a capital P, pervasive. I can't be more emphatic about this. If a person has a comorbid problem of serotonin and they have some kind of an executive function dopamine-related problem, I'm going to break these things down in just a moment. These two neurotransmitter systems are on two sides of a seesaw. So if you crank one up and there is a problem, you crank one up and there's a problem with the other one, it lowers it even more. And the same way, if you have serotonin, think how many people out there in the United States have had a depression, been given a serotonin product, and gone completely around the bend because their executive function went out the window. What did they call them? Bipolar. And really what it is, they just took that dopamine completely out of the prefrontal cortex and they're gone. Or you think about how many people have been given dopamine products, crash hard in the afternoon, they're angry, short-tempered, and nobody knows what to do. Well, they just haven't had the serotonin side of it taken care of because the person's not a crybaby. They missed the underlying serotonin problem clinically, which I'm going to tell you about in just a moment. Now, here are the clinical ways, this is the moment, serotonin clinically can be addressed. There's SAD, which is obvious, hurt, affective, inappropriately vulnerable, and the key there is they just get their feelings hurt too easily and they really get sad and they're depressed. That's the one that's in the book. That one's easy. That's in DSM-5. What's not in the book are the next 3. They're not in the book. And they're treated as bipolar or whatever. Think of Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino, my friends, those of you who've seen it. Clint in Gran Torino is angry with everybody. I am going to have to kill you. You know what I'm saying? He's mad about everything. Well, that anger, irritation is really born from vulnerability. You all know this. And if they're vulnerable and irritated, that is frequently associated with a serotonin problem. Then the third one is the whatever. This is touchy whatever, touchy whatever. I'm so touchy about what we're talking about, I'm going to blow it off. Now, most people who have an executive function problem with unmanageable cognitive abundance, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, can't blow anything off because they're thinking too much. But some people are able to do it, And if they blow it off, it could be apathy, indifference, isolation, and it could be related to a cognitive, I just can't deal with it. And then there's this third one, which I jokingly call political for guys and cheerleader for women. This is not a sexist remark. I'm just having a little bit of fun when I'm talking to people. These are individuals who are going to be outside appearance people. They're going to really do what they can to keep their grooming going, but internally, they're hurting big time. I've had people cry so many times where I've said, you look really good, but internally you're carrying a feeling of having been hit by the bus and nobody knows this. And they're like, how did you know? Well, it all added together. And when they're sad that way and they're carrying that sadness, but they look great, well, that's serotonin problem. I mean, this is not difficult. This is easy. So serotonin and dopamine balance issues are the most frequently missed issues in comorbid issues in my entire psychiatric practice, in my entire career. Fully 80% of second opinions in my office miss the serotonin dopamine problem. They miss the executive function, which is the dopamine side of it. They miss the 4 clinical subsets of depression, which is serotonin, which I just told you about. And urinary neurotransmitters are helpful, but they're not as clinically predictable. Some people are going to be thinking, hey, well, you could just test urinary neurotransmitters. I've worked with urinary neurotransmitter testing since, I can't remember when, but it's been more than 10 years, and that is not as predictable as the things that we're going to be talking about here, folks. The clinical is a big one. Then we're going to talk about these other elements. The clinical is where we're starting. And if you look at these 4 subtypes of depression with serotonin, I say, when I call people, I call them touchy, because depression is a bad word. You have to be a crybaby to be depressed, but anybody could be touchy. And if they're too touchy, it's very likely a serotonin problem. And executive function, we'll talk about that in just a moment. The PDF reference on serotonin dopamine imbalances, just so you folks can know, this is a PDF downloadable. Here it is, corebrainjournal.com. You don't have to leave your email for that. You can just take it right down. And that's the other reference right there, 140 references on the fact that serotonin and dopamine have significant imbalances. Yes, we're staying peer-reviewed with this. Then the second point, which I was talking about, is the clinical issue. The clinical issue, my friends, is the issue of executive function beyond ADHD diagnosis. And clinical beyond ADHD diagnosis has a lot to do with many, many things which we're going to talk about in great detail. If you know the clinical, you're much more likely to see what's going on with executive function and not miss it. The big problem, there are several different levels of executive function. I'm going to talk about one easy one that this is a take-home. This is an easy thing, and that is working memory. Working memory, my friends, is what's moved the entire human race ahead of a good hunting dog, cows, and well-trained elephants, okay? All the rest of the animals don't have what we human beings have in terms of working memory. And working memory does separate the wheat from the chaff, my friends. And working memory is what we do well most of the time. And if we have a significant problem with working memory, there is an executive function problem going on there, and we need to pay attention to it. It is involved with reaction timing regarding changing reality. What's made us successful as animals, scurrying around on the face of the earth? We can predict changing reality, weather, and we can do something before it hits, and we can protect ourselves from weather. A cow does not do that. A hunting dog does not do that. They may crawl under a tree, not too good. We build houses, we have cell phones, we get cars, we sail across the ocean because we want to get away from something. So reaction timing helps us understand treatment accuracy. If we're not paying attention to reaction timing, then we're missing the entire picture of executive function. That's why I'm not interested in, is he hyperactive or is he inattentive? I mean, yeah, you may see a little bit of it, but why not get into what's going on with the actual brain function and know what you're talking about? So this is a storm cloud coming in, the reality and timing. So I'm going to tell you about working memory so you can really have it applied. And this is a take home right here. So the storm cloud comes in. There's a reality, a change, and there's some thinking that goes on. There's executive function with working memory. Here's the storm. What are we going to do, my friends? Brain sequence in the storm is this. We think and see and recognize the storm. It settles in our brain. That's thinking. We act upon the possible consequences of the lightning bolts and the rain that we don't want to be in. And then we have the process of remembering. That's what's called working, thinking and acting, memory, remembering. That happens right here, my friends, up in the prefrontal cortex. If it isn't working properly, a person is desynchronized in some counterproductive way, which I'm going to tell you about right now. Working memory adjusts to changing reality in a sequence. 1, 2, 3. Here are the 3 ways. It identifies and thinks about changing reality, which is recognition. It takes action to manage each change, and a timely adjustment is working. And it carries that activity into the next days through time, memory. And I've got numerous examples of ways I talk about this, but that's a key point. If we're out there chasing butterflies and a storm comes in and we run into the barn to get away from the storm, that sounds completely inconsequential and ubiquitous. That is the human condition. That's what makes that running into the barn interesting. No other animals do that consistently the way we do. So if we get in the barn, and we will remember that for the rest of our lives unless we die from Alzheimer's, because I saw the storm. Remember that time chasing butterflies? We ran. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to be that far out. I thought that rain was coming. We got too far out in the field. I'm not going to do that again. Yep, I'm with you on that. Function. ADHD is desynchronized when a person has quote-unquote ADHD. Desynchronized both out of timing and context. The timing and the context is desynchronized. It's like dancing, but you're not out there on the floor dancing to the beat. You're out of cognitive step with changing reality. And you all have heard this back when you were in school, when you were a kid. It is a ubiquitous human term about our fellow humans. He or she is out of it. What do they mean? They're out of sync with changing reality. I can see it, you can see it, they can't see it. If they can't see it, they're either in denial or they're suffering from an executive function problem, and they know it. Think and speak in percentages. I'm cautioning everybody here. I am anti-reductionistic thinking. I'm against labels completely. And I'll tell you a reference that I've read on that one. You'll like it. Those of you who want to take this discussion a little bit further. Think in terms of percentages. If you're talking to somebody, let's talk about the percent that's out of balance and not really get too plaintive and worried about the part that's not that is in balance. So we get beyond labels, then we have clear targets because we're shooting at this part of the problem, not the entire human being. This is basic. So how do we target working memory? This is what we're doing. Timing does matter, my friends, and you know that. So I'm going to give you examples of brain function and changing reality, both adaptive and maladaptive. Here's the obvious one that everybody can see, and that's why everybody comes in and says, is he ADHD? Is he hyperactive? To me, if that conversation comes up, it's like, don't even say that to me. Don't bring that up because that's not relevant. Yeah, it's okay if we want to file for insurance or something like that. And yes, I shouldn't be so harsh about it. Yes, it's a symptom. It is a symptom. But that doesn't really tell me what I'm trying to fix. That doesn't tell me about brain function. That tells me about behavior. So acting without thinking is obvious, and anybody can get that one. What you're here for is because you want to get into the nuances of what's going on. And I'm going to tell you what the nuances are right now with executive function that work for me every day of my clinical work, and they'll work for you as well. Pardon me. This big one I'm going to talk about a great deal here in just a moment, thinking without acting. So if you're desynchronized, you can act without thinking. There's the rain cloud, but you acted without thinking. Means you went off and chased butterflies instead of running for the barn. You can think without acting. Let me think about this. Is it going to rain? Should I go under the tree over there? Should I run into the barn? The cows are out here. Maybe it's going to be okay. Electrical bolts might not hurt me. That's thinking without acting. And then the third one here is this. Cognitive anxiety. Oh, I forgot to mention this. Cognitive anxiety is not somatic anxiety. Thinking without acting is cognitive anxiety. My friends, that is not in the psychiatric diagnostic manual. It's in there a little bit because it's, again, the appearance part of it is OCD. OCD doesn't cover it. OCD can be a mix of affective and emotional and cognitive anxiety. Note, thinking without acting is the most commonly missed anxiety. It looks like OCD. It is cognitive anxiety. It differs because it's dopaminergically related, not serotonergically related. I was at a conference in, it was an island off the coast of, Madeira. I was on Madeira, and they had a big conference, and the company was a company that was selling a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor that they said was for OCD. And I stood up, and there were about 200 or 300 people in the room, and I said, well, what about cognitive anxiety? You know, cognitive anxiety and executive function. And I was like, you could hear a pin drop, I can tell you, because I was being a heretic right there in front of the believers. And the issue is, this is something I've been on since '96. This is the reason I went to work with Eamon right here, because Eamon had some appreciation about cognitive anxiety and the cingulate gyrus and so on, and he could show it on brain scans. I'm like, oh gosh, somebody gets with me on this on the biologic side. Cognitive anxiety creates attention, get this folks, abundance disorder, not attention deficit disorder. So, and how many people do you know have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder that don't have a deficit but have an abundance when you look at what's going on with them functionally? I mean, give me a break. Think about that. OCD is both cognitive and affective, can be either one or both. And sometimes it requires a combination of approaches to really get that taken care of. So the bottom line is what we really need to do. The new term, I'm not trying to make a name for myself. I'm just telling you this is something you can use. Why not call it AAD? Why not call it AAD if that's what it is? It's more respectful to the person. I mean, who wants to be called deficit when they got an abundance? I mean, that's a commonplace problem. I can see the relief on the kids' eyes when I say, you don't have a deficit, you got an abundance. They're like, hey, somebody gets me. No. What is not obvious is the third subtype. So we've got acting without thinking, we've got thinking without acting. Now we're getting into avoidance. There are two types of avoidance. Not acting and not thinking is the avoidance, but that's not the two types. The two types are starting and finishing. Think about this. There's an avoidance with starting, which is called procrastination, and there is a avoidance with finishing, which is called procrastination. What is the one that everybody pays attention to? What's the obvious one? Finishing. Nobody thinks about starting. Starting is, you know what starting is called? When person is not going to start, they call that avoidance, and they call it, get what this is. Get this, a personality disorder. Those people have a personality. They're incurable. We might as well put them in psychoanalysis because they're avoiding things, and then about 5 or 6 years of psychoanalysis on the couch would work for them. No, that's not the way to approach it. So improved targets will help with pattern recognition. Now we're going to go over to a whole nother level. So we've talked about the clinical. We started talking about the med problems that occur. Now we're in the clinical things. Now we're into the biomedical measures. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Dr. Bill Walsh here because I think it's relevant. I think he is a thought leader in this regard, and he's running kind of a parallel. A lot of you folks are familiar with Ben Lynch and others who are talking, Amy Yasko, are talking about genetic polymorphisms and 2D and MTHFR and that sort of thing. My experience has been that they're helpful, but the Walsh protocols and the way they're thinking about it takes it into another step. And I'm going to mention these to you. Walsh and his ADHD research data points have 5,600 patients, 500,000 blood urine chemistries, 350,000 medical history factors. He's done a significant amount of work on these different subtypes of ADHD based on phenotypes, how they look on the outside and what is actually going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to talk to you about some of these different ADHD subtypes that are going to, migrate over into the spectrum in some respects. The incidence of chemical imbalances in ADHD. Number one, 68% have an elevated copper. 92% have an insufficient ceruloplasmin. Ceruloplasmin is the protein that carries copper into the cell, and if ceruloplasmin is insufficient, guess what? The copper is going to be free copper. If it's free copper, what happens with free copper? It's all over the place, and it directly interferes with dopamine and other neurotransmitter metabolism. With the problem with copper, there's a zinc depletion. These are people that have zinc depletion. These are people that have a methylation disorder, 55%. 30% have a pyrrole disorder. We've seen it numerous times. And malabsorption, 11%. That malabsorption group is going to be directly related to immunoglobulin G. And this is Nutrient Power by Dr. Walsh right here. There's the reference. So let's start with copper-zinc imbalances in ADHD. Copper levels are regulated by metallothionein, okay? SNP mutations can weaken metallothionein function, resulting in copper overload and zinc deficiency. Key point. So back to point. You have the copper up, the zinc down. What are you going to have? I'll show you in just a moment. Excess copper can severely deplete dopamine levels. Low dopamine function is, guess what? Associated with ADHD. There's the reference right there, biochemistry of copper. Here's what it looks like on a schematic. Boom. This is right out of the book. Here's dopamine, copper, vitamin C, and dopamine beta hydroxylase change dopamine over to norepinephrine. If you have a bunch of copper, you're going to download the dopamine over to norepinephrine, and you're going to have a N norepinephrine. Nerves is what that is. Think of the acronym. What does an excess of norepinephrine do? Nerves. They feel anxious down in their bones. What kind of anxiety do they have? More often than not, cognitive anxiety, but it can get so bad it can be affective as well. Individualized measured nutrient therapy. Medical history, you need to take a medical history and review the symptoms. There's a special blood and urine lab tests that occur. We'll talk about them in a moment. The diagnosis of chemical imbalances and prescribed nutrient program to normalize brain chemistry through getting neurotransmission corrected. So these are ways in nutrient therapy that you can help. You want to know what those lab tests are, what the chemical imbalances are. Now we're getting down to this third level of where the rubber actually meets the road. Typical inattention. Now we're going to break the various ADD subtypes into biochemical subtypes. Inattention has low dopamine activity. There's a reference. Copper excess, frequently. Low GABA activity. Zinc deficiency, another reference. Toxic metal overload, fatty acid imbalances, and malabsorption. We're not going to go into each one of those. We don't have time for it. But inattention, and the only point I'm making with this particular slide is, folks, we need to measure these things and think about them. And yes, you could say, well, Parker, you said you don't need to do the neurotransmitter testing. Neurotransmitter testing is helpful. It's not necessary, because what happens when you actually do these other tests, it tells you what's going on most of the time, not all the time, most of the time with these other imbalances. Typical hyperactivity. We just did inattention. We're talking about phenotypic now. Phenotypic hyperactivity, excess activity at norepinephrine and adrenaline receptors. Copper overload, because you have the copper pushing the dopamine down, executive functions out the window, norepinephrine, adrenaline up, and over methylation is a big one. I've seen so many people that were treated for what they thought was an undermethylation because their SNP on their MTHFR polymorphism looked like they were undermethylated, and they got a bunch of methylation products and blew them right out the top. So they were completely paralyzed with anxiety, and they were overmethylated. And if you just do the whole blood histamine, you can see what's going on. Treatment measures. This is how we do treatment with these individuals. Treatment approach, let's talk about hyperactivity. If you reduce the norepinephrine, the adrenal neurotransmission, that helps. Normalize serum copper and plasma zinc. And then the folates help, B12, B6, GABA, and augmenting nutrients. And we don't do folic acid, we do folinic acid because of the fact that the folinic acid is much more effective and less problematic. So note there, the antioxidants and other nutrients assist the effectiveness of the primary nutrients. We're not going to have time to go into all that. Treatment approach to oppositional defiant. Again, I'm staying with the DSM-5 to take it into other meanings that are biomedically reasonable. Again, these are going to be available on the slides. Enhanced neurotransmission at serotonin and NMDA receptors. So what happens is if you have a serotonin problem, this is what I was talking about all the way back, where the person's touchy and easily have their feelings hurt. Well, this is what we're talking about. NMDA is glutamate. So you've got a couple of different things going on with serotonin and glutamate. SAMe or methionine to enhance the expression of SERT reuptake genes. Basically what methionine and SAMe is, they take those presynaptic transporter proteins and crank them up. They enhance the expression so that they're actually more, they're not undermethylated, they're more, the methylation actually takes place. It's going to promote glutamate activity and at NMDA receptors with zinc, selenium, GSH, and other antioxidants. All right, so now we're down to the treatment approach. Now, how many of you heard of episodic rage disorder? Hey, you know, it's there. It's Jekyll-Hyde behavior. They do have genuine remorse. They go completely around the bend. They have a very typical biochemistry, and this is what it is. And I'm going to give you some references with some podcasts that I've done on pyrrole, copper, and zinc, and you can have all this much more emphatically than I can do in this short presentation. And then we have a treatment approach which normalizes serum copper, plasma, zinc, and urine pyrroles, and that's in these podcasts that I'll be telling you about in just a moment. Treatment approach for conduct disorder. How many of you have known people that are treated for like conduct disorder? That is, to me, the most oversimplified. You know, conduct disorder, it's sort of like personality disorder. Conduct disorder, personality, that means you don't know what you're doing. That's what that means. And because if you're looking at it biomedically, those are phenotypes, but you get down to biomedical, you got a whole different thing. Urine cryptopyrrole is up 65%. Copper-zinc imbalance with high copper, elevated toxic metals, all of those directly relate to conduct disorders. And remember, these are the interviews that are going to talk about this. Dr. Walsh interviews on Core Brain Journal, and CBJ is an abbreviation, is corebrainjournal.com, and I have all my podcasts documented by numbers, corebrainjournal.com/115. That's the methylation. And on that 115, all of these are linked as well, so you can just go to 115 and click on all those. I've got them all loaded up there. And those are all 1-hour specials with Dr. Walsh, because I think his message needs to go out to the public. In fact, that methylation interview with Dr. Walsh is my most frequently downloaded interview of all the, I've done over 200 interviews. We have over 15,000 downloads a month. And of all of them, that's the one that's the most downloaded. I think people are interested in what I'm talking to you about tonight. So do join our podcast at Core Brain Journal. It's on iTunes. It's Google. If you want to come on as a guest in some reason, you know, we're happy to have mothers on. We're having to have clients on. If you're a medical professional and you want to come on as a guest, just make an application there. We want to have the dialogue with everybody. This isn't about professionals talking to professionals. This is about professionals talking to the public and informing the public so the public becomes informed, like we're trying to do this evening, and really get some knowledge across to people so they can become right there in participatory medicine. These slides, I had it on the first slide. This is coming down near the last slide. If you go to corebrainjournal.com/ARS, Autism Recovery, how come I'm blocking it? Too late at night. Seminar. That's funny. Autism Recovery S. You know what it is. I'm going to go on. So excellent, but not enough. Ebony. This is Dr. Edward DeBono. He says, excellent, but not enough. Summit is the word I was looking for. I knew it would come to me. So excellent but not enough is Ebony Edward DeBono. And the video explanations for your review, which go into all these things I'm talking about more emphatically, cognition. There's that link right there, corepsych.com/diagnosis. It takes you to the videos on YouTube. I got tons of videos on YouTube that explain it. And you can have your doctor look at it. And if you want to say, hey, here's how it works, take a look at it. And then metabolism, med, burn rate, IgG, there it is, corepsych.com/GI. DOE, duration of effectiveness, corepsych.com/dose. Video explanations for your review. These are add-ons to try to take it down to where you live and breathe at your home, wherever you happen to be globally. Comorbid issues, serotonin. This is the balance, the dopamine thing I was talking about a moment ago. I've got a whole specific video on dopamine, serotonin balance. Then how do you understand those comorbid issues more emphatically with other comorbid issues? And that's the drop in the afternoon. How many of you out there have been on a stimulant and seen the drop in the afternoon but don't know what to do about it? That's a whole playlist of, I think, 7 videos that break down the drop in the afternoon. And then there's the download this ADHD video list. If you want to do that, here's the list in PDF. And the PDF on that details, corepsych.com/details, has a link on it that you can get, has links on the PDF so you can just click on them and go to them. And then drug interactions and antidepressants, that's the 2D6 video explaining what I talked about just a moment ago. I think this is the most important book in my life so far. I've read a lot of books, I can tell you, but this one changed my life back in 1969. And Science and Sanity was given to me, recommended. He didn't give it to me. Recommended to me by a very unlikely person who looked like Elvis Presley. He was an internist at where I was interning. He seemed like a very plastic guy with a Mark IV red Lincoln Continental, but he was a very interesting guy. And he suggested this book to me, and it's really changed my life. And I strongly recommend it to you. Non-Aristotelian Systems and General Semantics as it applies to science and sanity, how we can think more correctly about the things that we use and the tools that we use. So our evolution of thinking involves systems, time, and change, reptilian thinking versus systems thinking. A Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. I strongly recommend that book. And we have a whole number of mindset experts at Core Brain Journal that are talking about this particular issue, Thinking Fast and Slow. I think on that particular page we have probably somewhere between 20 and 30 experts talking about this whole phenomenon. So in closing, I got carried away there a little bit. I've enjoyed speaking with you folks. I'm really interested in any feedback that you have. We'll welcome any feedback. And certainly we've given you a number of ways to get connected. And so we hope you enjoyed this presentation. We hope more important and beyond enjoying it, that it proves useful for you in your lives and the lives of those you love and those you care about, and has application on the broader scale so that you can actually use it going down the road. Thank you very much, folks. I appreciate your attention tonight. Have a good evening.